Welcome to Semi-Sages of the Pages, the writing podcast where we're not sure where we're going, but we're having an adventure.
This podcast contains adult themes and language at times.
At times? What fun is that?
And discretion is advised.
Things are about to get super steamy as we talk about how to write a sex scene. I'm Morgan.
Ooh. This is Molly.
This is Sarah.
I'm Teresa. I think what comes next for this one is going to be a warning. We do have our warning that we do, sometimes have adult conversations in our podcast, but this one is a very adult conversation. So please be aware as you're listening to it in the car with your kids.
I mean, I don't know what we're going to talk about exactly in detail yet, but I would, in trying to divine the future, probably say maybe don't listen to it with your kids in the car.
No judgment.
I mean, let's just get it right out of the way. Penis. There we go.
Adult content has been established. This is a warning to anyone who is uncomfortable with sexual content
like us.
Or genitalia.
Yep.
Awkward.
It's interesting how uncomfortable even we are bringing this up. As of the four of us, none of us are willing to just jump in on this.
I mean, I just said penis really loudly.
Excuse me, Molly dove in. Molly just dove straight in head first.
Yeah.
It's true. I did. I wasn't, and yet, I'm not someone who really writes sex scenes, but I was, was willing to try to jump into the topic. I think this is important to talk about. One of the reasons we wanted to talk about this subject is it's a reality of writing, and it's not something that we have seen a lot of guidance on, because there is kind of a stigma. There's some embarrassment about writing sex scenes. No one wants to talk about it, even outside of, and we're not explicitly talking erotica here. In general, we are talking about outside of erotica, other genres that are not, erotica. So I guess maybe should we start there about, kind of genre expectations for sex, or should we start with that romantic chemistry?
Let's start with genre expectations. There's a lot of different levels of sex and stories. There's erotica, which is full on. Oftentimes, there's not it's pornography. It's written pornography. There's not a lot of plot to it. It's just written out sex scenes between characters. And then you've got like romance, and the different levels of that, all the way up to clean romance, which is no sex whatsoever, maybe a little bit of kissing. And if there is sex in it, it's, the door closes. It's
alluded to.
Exactly.
And I think that's explained in romance writing from the classes I've taken as how much heat it has, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a heat index.
Yeah,
so,
heat or steam.
Yeah, right. So the steamier it is or the hotter it is, the more intense or graphic. Yeah. And then the cooler it is. And then obviously, I don't need to say this, but I will anyway, middle grade is absolutely taboo for any kind of sex scenes. And YA really depends on your audience, what you're going for, and should be used with the utmost discretion.
Agreed. That's a really good caveat there. I'm sure it's out there, but you really shouldn't be writing YA erotica.
That's weird. That's really weird.
Yeah.
Full on judgment on that. Now, bringing it to the experiences that we've had as sages writing sex scenes or not writing sex scenes, because we all write different genres. And for me, I'd always had a rule of I shall not write sex scenes because I always thought that was private and should be between the characters. So even though I would write, what did you say? Heat versus steam. So I would write heated scenes. and wasn't really into the steamy scenes. I've since changed that rule quite recently with the Animal Court, which felt very foreign and weird for me. And I had to do a lot of research into writing sex scenes, which was also very strange and foreign. But, that was one of the things that interested me in doing this episode was, how do we talk about writing sex scenes? How do we write a sex scene? And, whose perspective should it be from? Have you guys experienced that too? Like when you're writing, how do you write a scene from deciding whose perspective it should be from?
It's a good question. So I write first person, and everything I've written's been from the woman's point of view. So I would say the woman's point of view. What do you guys think?
The most challenging sex scene, it wasn't a full-on sex scene, but it was definitely a makeout scene I ever wrote, was my two homosexual characters and designers. And then they're in a makeout scene, and then they actually get in a fight over it. And so that took a lot of beta readers' input and help. And I'm writing way outside of my comfort zone there, but in the sense that I have no personal experience with it, but I really wanted to tell this story, and specifically the character that I based it on is someone I'm super close to, and I really wanted his story to be told. So we co-wrote the scene together. So he kind of wrote like, well, this is what would happen, or that was gross, or don't do that, And that actually was fun. I thought it was going to be kind of creepy. Like, how do you write, a sex scene with someone that you would never, ever have any kind of like intimacy with? And it ended up being super cool and honest. And I thought it promoted like a whole new level of awareness for me. And it's probably some of the best stuff I've ever written. So that was really eye-opening. And also it showed me that inviting people into the process that have different voices made me feel both more confident and more free, And then I think we got more gritty than I would have by myself. I don't feel like, he would be like, get in there, make this steam. He definitely pulled the steam up for me. And he's actually a little more reserved. And I'm more out there. So we kind of switched roles. And that was really, really fun. So that was one of my experiences writing I don't know if that helps anyone, but I would invite you to bring other ideas or voices into it if you're like me and you're writing third person and you have characters outside of your experience.
We all hear horror stories, or we've read horror stories of scenes that are written, and sometimes, we see them on social media all the time, of, men writing women's perspective during sex scenes. All you have to do is look at My Dad Wrote a Porno, that wonderful podcast, to kind of be like, that's not what to do.
That's not how that works.
But would you guys ever be comfortable writing a sex scene from a man's point of view?
Yeah, I wanted it to serve the story. So in my story, the character's arc is that he is uncomfortable with his own sexuality and his lover is trying to help him embrace it. And his arc is like discovering it's okay to be himself, right? And he's fighting that. And the only way to really do that is to put him in the situation where he's facing it, fully, and his lover and him are navigating the religious shame and the situation that he was presented with versus his own desire, right? And I felt that it would be cowardly of me to not go there.
The when you talk about cowardly, I think that influences us as writers writing sex scenes more than it should sometimes, or at least did when I was a younger writer. So I mostly, you guys know this, I mostly write young adult, so I don't have to go there in general, like I don't have to cross that threshold into actual sex scenes. But I'm at a point now where if I wanted to write something adult, if I wanted to write something where it was appropriate to have a sex scene, I would. But definitely like a few years ago, I would not have done that. Even if it would have been appropriate, not only just appropriate, but needed to be there, I wouldn't have been comfortable writing a sex scene because I just personally wouldn't have felt comfortable. I don't know. I don't know why, because maybe it's because I know that like people I know read my work, and you think that there's some sort of judgment in there. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that even if your book needs a sex scene, and not even going into like how to write the sex scene, just that it's important to acknowledge that writing one is difficult in terms just putting it on the page and getting over that mental hurdle of writing it, and like Morgan, like what you said, like not being, I guess, a coward, and that's extreme, but that's it's a difficult thing to do for a lot of us. There is a stigma against doing it.
Well, and people are so hypercritical. Like even going to write, I mean, I wrote this specific character arc to help someone I love who wanted it to be done, who we talked about it in the drafting of the book, who, helped me edit the book. And we wanted to talk about, he was an individual who was religiously oppressed, who had serious issues about his sexuality, and who, had a lover help him overcome that and finally come out to his family. And, he wanted this to be told in and it's a futuristic sci-fi, so I spun it a lot of different ways. But the whole time, I'm not, I am worried about, well, how is it perceived that I'm the author of that story, right? Because people can be so judgmental of like what gives you the right to tell that story. Or, I mean, it's even a comment like when you query, it's one of the questions that they ask over and over again, which is like, why are you the person to write this book? And I feel like that sex scene like puts an exclamation point on that.
I know, and Molly did a great semi-sode on like, write what you know. But we write spec fiction. So there's a certain element of imagination in that. And I think I think that there's a risk of, I am a suburban middle-class white woman. I shouldn't only write those kind of stories. That's not appropriate either. So we have to find that balance of that. Should I only write novels from the perspective of an administrator in a healthcare setting? No, it would be really boring. You don't want to read that. So I think we need to, as writers, honor other perspectives. However, using beta readers and sensitivity readers to make sure we're not missing something.
Well, I think the word here is honoring, right? It's not, you don't just write the other perspective for kicks and giggles, and you don't write it. I think this is the key, like bringing it back to you asking, like, would I ever write it in a male's perspective? And the answer is yes. But like you said, honoring it, I wouldn't just write it to write it. And I wouldn't just write it off the top of my head being like, la, 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 this is probably right. It's one like what Morgan did. Like you find someone you're comfortable with, that you trust, and you talk to them and you say, does this make sense? Is this realistic? You go and you talk to, critique partners or beta readers, or, maybe if you have a significant other or a family member, this is a sensitive topic. It might be hard to like broach that for certain people, but you have to, I mean, I have a couple people I would trust, and I would ask them about it.
Right. I totally agree with you, Molly. I just wrote a scene for the urban thriller that I'm writing from a 13-year-old boy's perspective. I have no experience as a 13-year-old boy. and so I'm currently trying to find beta readers for that scene, but it's also a sensitive scene. So I can't just be like, hey, 13-year-old boys that I know, can you read this? So I have to also be aware of that as I go along. So I'm asking my adult male friends, like, put yourself back in time to your 13-year-old self. Is this appropriate? Is this what you would have been thinking? Is this what, just to try to get that idea and replicate that as best I can and see if I'm on the right track or not. Likewise, writing for the sex scenes from the male perspective, I would have no idea what that's like. So I would go to my male friends or who I'd be comfortable talking with that about, and or the internet, which is, the internet. But I definitely encourage our male writing friends to do the same for writing about female experiences. Because, going back to what Teresa was saying, how we've all read horrible sex scenes written by men from the female's perspective.
Yeah.
Kudos to you, gentlemen, for writing those. It is hard. These scenes are hard to write. So well done. However, I do advise, as I believe we all do some more research, talk to those beta readers, see if what you're writing makes sense or is physiologically impossible, because there's been quite a few scenes that I have read where I'm like, that's not at all what that does.
Yeah,
So
please Google female anatomy, please.
yes.
Because and this is not a common one, but this is one that I've heard before. Like, he grabbed her by the cervix. And you're like, no,
No.
not a thing. Don't do that. She would need surgery afterwards.
I was going to say, that just became a horror story right there.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
God.
guys. Yeah.
But sort of related to that, but not quite. It's also important, like, even if the sex that you write or the sex scene or the makeout session or whatever that you write can be anatomically correct, it can be technically correct, but you have to remember the audience that you are addressing. So
Right.
one thing, for example, and I ended up talking to someone, this was a while ago about this, because it was a male writing and he wanted to write kind of female erotica targeted at females. One thing we ended up talking about was, like, if you read it, not only just the character, the point of view is female point of view, but it's point of view the target market is female. The certain, how do I want to put this? The sex acts that you write about, it matters. Like, in general, and this is like, it changes all the time, but like, you want to see, instead of like females performing oral sex on males perform the oral sex on the females. Things like that, like it is in service to the female. Is typically, if you have a female audience, then the sex is in service to the female in general.
So can I add two? I was doing some research from romance authors on building romantic tension and writing sex scenes, and they gave us two tips that I think really apply to what Molly is saying. The first one, and going back to what Teresa was saying, the first one is if you're really in a good makeout session, you're not as much thinking about their lips as you are the overall sensation of how they make you feel. If you're in a really crappy makeout session, you know exactly where their hands are. You know exactly where the saliva is. Like, you can smell things. Like, so it was really interesting because I was like, that's so true. Like, as writers, we try to get into the sensory details, but I think when the makeout is going right, you're more about lost in the moment of the overall giving of yourself and the way it makes you feel all over, the connection or the communion, and less about like that he's biting your lip or, his tongue is pushing into your mouth. In fact, that feels kind of gross. Like when you say that, it takes away from,
right.
His connection. So
yeah.
Especially, and I don't know if that's true from a male perspective, but I definitely know that that's true we're all shaking our heads. So this is like very true from a female perspective. We want to be careful not to get too much into the anatomy part of it if we're going for a romantic connection between our main characters. And the second one, I think Molly really hit on the head, which is so often romantic partnerships don't work because we won't make them equal. And a lot of times that happens in the bedroom. So he's like perfect and gorgeous and handsome, and she's like not self-assured and, hates her nose and is like overly self-deprecating. And then you're like, having a hard time as a reader loving the sex scene and getting into it because there's too big of a gap, either physically or emotionally, or and so if they don't both have flaws and they both don't have strengths and they're not making each other better, then it's hard for us to get on board. So I think that's good advice for writing the sex scene, but it's also good advice for the novel. I think too often, and I see this more, I'm going to be honest, with female writers, where we tend to over idealize sometimes our romantic male partners, I think, and then make our females more well-rounded. And then I think that comes out in the sex scene. And so that's all I have to say about that.
That's a good point. One thing about that is that the sex scene should serve the plot, unless you're writing that genre of romance or erotica where you're just tucking those in just, for voyeurism value. But if you're kind of writing that middle of the road sex scene, it has to serve a point to the plot. It has to help serve the character arcs. And not just falling in love just isn't enough of that, because you could have characters falling in love and not have a sex scene. Clean romance does it all the time. So why is the sex scene happening now? And how are the characters going to develop because of it?
Yeah, that is a great point. And that's something I think your writing does really well, Teresa. And to piggyback on that and what Morgan said, like, there should be a point. Like, there's a reason why your sex scene is there. And your sex scene can tell you so much about who your characters are and the relationship that they have with each other. And who is in control, who is being vulnerable. Are they vulnerable together? How are they growing and adapting to each other? Are they trusting? Some of the best sex scenes are like the rivals, like they're two people and they're rivals, right? And then okay, when they're passionate together, but they're still rivals, when they come together in the bedroom, are they still rivals there? Are they able to trust each other? Ooh, that's why it works, right? Because oh, thank you, kitten. That's partially why the sex scene works and why it's there.
Yeah, the enemies to lover trope does work really well for sex scenes because they can be very, very intense. And a good read. But then you've also kind of got how if it's enemies to lovers and they have sex, their relationship is going to change. And so you kind of have that aftermath too. And actually, with those, my favorite part is afterwards. Like, do they just get up and leave? Is there a conversation? What's the net? Does somebody
do they cuddle? Do they not?
Right. That's the stuff I want to know about. Because again, it's about the relationship changing. One thing that Morgan said earlier that I wanted to circle back to was you made the comment of he pushed his tongue into her mouth. And you said that's not romantic. And it's because of the word push.
Oh, interesting.
Word choice matters. And here's the thing about, and a lot of people learn about sex from pornography. And pornography in general is not violent toward women, but it's not women focused. It's very much like it can be very male dominant. And so a lot of times when sex scenes aren't ringing true, especially if they're from the female's perspective, we're not using the right language choices. We're using plunge, push, violates.
More aggressive words.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And that's been a common thing that we'll see, especially in romances from the 70s and the 80s. And it is shifting, but I think a lot of people don't realize they're still using those aggressive terms to describe sex in sex scenes.
Do you think that and I mean, what are your just thoughts in general about how this affects like the LGBTQIA community? And, do you think that holds true in other communities? Do you think that language is ever sexy to any people?
there's something for everybody. There is that, and there's various kinks out there and things that people are specifically interested in looking for. I mean, look at how successful 50 Shades of Grey was.
I do want to bring something up, which is I think it is important that characters clearly show consent.
Bingo.
Even if someone has a kinky things, or they like things that are different than what you like, which is fine. It's all fine. People are into different things, like Sarah said, and that's fine as long as there is consent. As long as those boundaries are established and held to. And, if you have a character that agrees to do something, and then the boundaries that they set are violated, that is no longer sexy. That is flat out no longer sexy. And it isn't. And I think it's important is not the right word. It's critical that for me, it's very important to not represent something as romantic, as sexy, when it isn't. So for me, non-consent is not sexy. It's not romantic. Kidnapping someone, it's not sexy. It's not romantic. Violating someone's boundaries, it's not sexy. It's not romantic. And to represent it otherwise, I think is immoral at best. And that's my stand on that one.
I recently read an article about writing detailed rape scenes. Now, not from a romantic perspective. This is like a thriller story, for example, and a character is raped in it, and it makes an impression on the individual, and they have to grow from that. And the article was really interesting because it was getting into how detailed do you go before you, the author, are on a different level of creepy. And how does that affect you as the author? And I thought that was really interesting. And I, of course, would never detail a rape scene because that's not what I stand for as a writer. Have I had characters who experience that? Yes. Would I detail their experience in any kind of extent? No. I would talk about the horror, but getting into the nitty gritty of what they went through is like you were saying, Molly, it's immoral. It's just, I don't know. It's a violation even of these characters who exist in our minds. And because, as what I was saying earlier, there are people who did get off on that, and that's just not okay. And I feel like for me as a writer, talking from my perspective, I would never be okay with that. But my works being that, serving that for somebody.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I know there's a genre, it's dark romance that can be, kind of rough and sometimes a little violent. And rape or that type of thing is a subset of that. And I think the four of us are going to kind of take a stand here. And I hope it's okay that I speak for that. And we're going to say we're not going to write that ever. And yes, I frankly speaking, for me, I will be judgmental towards that. I think you significantly damage women's sexuality when you say that a violent sexual act is romantic.
And it's not just damaging women.
A violent sexual act without consent. I'm going to take that back. A violent sexual act without consent is romantic.
And it's not, one, it's not romantic, it's not sexy, it's not okay. And not only does it damage women, like it to our young girls or young people who maybe aren't experienced, it gives us this idea that this is okay. But it also tells our young men that it's okay. And it's not. There is no excuse. There is no, oh, boys just being boys. It's not okay. And it's not, I know a lot of guys, you don't have to be that way. It's not okay to encourage that side either. Sorry.
It also goes, oh no, you're good. It also goes beyond male to female violence. And that's something I want to say as well. Yes. This goes across all the boards, male to male, female to female, Like Teresa said, any non-consensual
female
is
on
violent
male.
act. Female
Yeah.
on, yes,
It's not
very
okay
much
for
so.
females to hit males.
Right.
Morgan, what were you going to say?
Well, to be clear, you're not saying that none of us are ever going to write a rape scene, right?
No.
No.
Writing a rape
But just-
scene as romance.
I can't agree.
Yes.
Yeah,
We can't
that's the
write.
thing.
Yeah.
because I think that it's, I think a well-written scene that talks about the damage that it does to women and why that's wrong can provide insight into helping people make better choices or helping people heal from that have actually experienced that. And so I don't want to leave the impression that that should never be tackled, because I think that speaking as a survivor who read that in high school, I found comfort in watching the characters of certain books survive that and find purpose and meaning and not let it define them, And I think there is value in that. And I just want to make sure we're not conflating the two and that we're super clear about there is a place and a purpose for it. But I think this whole conversation just reminds me a lot of Game of Thrones and all the controversy that came out in some of the scenes of Game of Thrones and how they were portrayed. I mean, would you agree with that, or do you think that's off?
No, I agree. And I think, I think some of the controversial scenes in Game of Thrones, some of that now, okay, well, Game of Thrones was really long and involved. Which controversial scenes or couples are you talking about?
Before we get into this, I do think it's important, like Morgan said, to emphasize we're not saying you can't talk about rape. We're not saying you can't write it, portray it, all that kind of stuff. I think our stand is rape is not romantic. And portraying a violent, non-consensual act as a positive or romantic
or sexy,
right,
is not something we believe is something that you should do. But like you said, talking about rape, that kind of thing is something that should be discussed, because the number of women who have been sexually assaulted or raped is really high.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a small problem. It is 20 or 25% of females have reported something like or say that they have had something happen to them. So it's not an isolated problem.
A number of people who have been sexually violated.
Yes.
Not just women.
Yes, thank you. You are absolutely correct. I mean, women have said that, but women are not the only ones who experience it.
Right. I kind of a side note. I took a class a few years ago, and about dealing with these issues as coming from a therapist perspective, and we had an entire session on men who were sexually violated or who were abused verbally or physically, and they said that, or the presenter said, and granted this was a few years ago, so the statistics might have changed. There were just as many male sexual victims as there were females, but they're just not reported. Because, there's the taboo of, oh, man can't get abused, and it's just this ideology that we have as a society that it's not okay for a man to come forward if they've been abused. And that's for any gender identity or sexual preference, that a man cannot come forward with these issues. So, objectification happens, and we don't want that to happen. We don't want to see that happening as writers for anybody.
Agreed. All right. I think we went off in a good tangent, a really necessary one. But let's maybe see if we can
roll it back.
Yeah.
I think this is my change of subject. I think talking about semen is not sexy. That
I
is
would agree.
that's what
Again, everybody has kind of their kink.
Movies, I mean, they look good. So depends on which craft they're on, maybe.
Sorry, what'd you say?
I said it depends. I always thought a navy suit was kind of sexy. I like the white hat and then the dark.
I'm sorry, it just took me a long time to get that joke.
Puns.
That's
Puns.
fantastic.
Coming at you.
Okay, sorry.
Can we?
Men, they're sexy. Like there's a segue.
All right, Sarah, you gonna bring us around to somewhere?
I don't know. My husband, when he was in a pilot uniform, I was like,
So kind of summarizing all of that minus our Siemens. You know, when you're writing sex scenes, of course, write it as you feel appropriate and necessary. Talk to your beta readers and all of that. Make sure it's within line of everybody's perspective of your genre, of what your characters may or not be in line with their preferences or doing. But also definitely do the research for the kinks or lifestyle choices that you may not know or have, so that you're representing them correctly. So don't just be like, they were into DMSM or whatever the acronym is, and then have them knitting while they're, doing their dirty or whatever. Clearly, I'm very learned on this subject. So, just do your research into these scenes and go down those weird Google rabbit holes and, talk to your beta readers.
Or with incognito mode on.
Be sure you have incognito.
And don't do that at work. Yeah.
Don't do it at work.
I was going to say, to that point, that was one of the frustrations I think a lot of people, as popular as 50 Shades of Grey was, there was definitely a section of the population that said, that's not correct at all. So to that point, do your research.
I love how our advice for how do you write sex scenes? Do your research.
It's amazing how many people don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we get that doing research on this subject can be uncomfortable for people. But that's not an excuse.
And sometimes you'll find some really funny stuff. Like one time I text these guys that I was looking up dick jokes from the 1800s, and it was fantastic what I got to learn about Victorian perspectives of male genitalia. You'll find all sorts of fun things looking up in incognito the sex research.
I remember you texting that because we started making jokes about, people's rods and shooting arrows.
Yep. It was great. It was a good time.
Slang for sex and then slang for body parts too. That's a whole big rabbit hole.
Maybe what you're saying there is because you don't want to just jump on and do generic research. That's not super helpful. But maybe what you're saying is know your character's perspective. I think I think the real advice there is decide 1, who is telling the sex scene. 2, how is it serving the plot? 3, what is the tension doing? And then use details that serve the character and the plot and the tension in that scene to bring your reader into the head of the character so that you can make that as authentic as possible. Is that the right takeaway?
Yes.
I think that's great. Yeah. And, quick apology for saying dick jokes. I'm sorry if I offended anybody. One thing too, and to branch off of that, if you're
hate Richards.
Yeah, darn those Richards. If you're writing fantasy from a certain time period, or if you're writing historical, be sure you do look up those terms to see how things were referred to in that time period, and just be aware of your genre and your audience as well. Good takeaways there.
Agree.
Yeah, I think we can all tell Morgan's I can't talk. I think we can all tell Morgan's the teacher.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. She took all of our mess of an episode and just made it perfect.
Well, whatever you're doing out there, writing your first or second or 50th sex scene, I hope you have fun with the steam of it, though. Have fun with it. Because if you're not feeling it, your audience won't be,
Right.
And they can always pull you back.
Yeah.
They can. Like, I've had to have them pull me back. But if there's no steam there to pull back, I think that's a much bigger problem.
Mm-hmm.
Than if you get the chemistry and get it on the page. You can cutting is so much easier than creating.
Right.
And I thought you had a great point talking about like the steam, the heat doesn't always come from like the physical anatomy. So much it comes from like how you're feeling or not how, well, yeah, but how the character is feeling and their sensation in their head and, what they're thinking, not necessarily like, they're doing calculus in their head, but like those emotions that they're going through and stuff like that are so much more powerful.
Yeah,
Don't you think like how good sex is how your partner makes you feel about yourself?
We're all nodding.
A great like partner makes you feel sexy even when you didn't 5 minutes earlier, or like, they are able to make you feel special and wanted and help bring you into your power, and I think that if we could get our characters to do that too, and maybe that's a hint for men writing females' perspective. Like, we like men who make us feel sexy, even when we don't feel sexy.
Partners in general.
I'm sure the reverse is also true. I'm sure.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Baba boom, go get it.
I think that sounds like we've come to a wrap on this episode. Yeah,
I think so.
I think so.
So thanks everyone for listening today. We hope you learned a ton, or at least were amused by us. If you want to listen to us more, you want to connect with us further, we have all the social media.
Check us out on our webpage, semisagesofthepages.com.
There's always Facebook, Semi-Sages of the Pages.
Or come hang out with us on Discord, Semi-Sages of the Pages.
And we also have a lovely Twitter, or if you don't want to do that and you just want to drop us a line, offer us a correction, because I'm sure we messed up something, you can always shoot us an email, semisages@gmail.com. And make sure, if you like this podcast, to go and give it a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast listening service. All right, ladies. Anything else? Or are we signing off for the day?
Signing off.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Semi-Sages of the Pages. Music used in the introduction was the song 5 Armies by Kevin MacLeod, which you can find at incomptech.com. It is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0, which can be found at creativecommons.org/licenses/by/3.0. Whew, that's a wrap.
So what are we doing? Are we doing queries or sex first?
I mean, sex always comes first.